Welcome to the exoduscry podcast, where we have honest conversations around exploitation, trafficking, sexual culture, and justice.
It's been a minute, Helen, since we've had a chance to sit down together.
It has, I know.
And here we are. What do you have to say? I know you have lots to say. We're going to get to all that. What I want to say is that we have a really exciting update about work we've been doing lately in Australia and New Zealand, which I'm going to turn that over to you in just a moment. But to give some context for that, I wanted just to share a little bit for our listeners about the significance of Australia and New Zealand in the fight against trafficking. So you and I have been at this for a while together. Around the time that you started working with us, we were doing trips out to Australia and New Zealand to tour our film Nefarious. Mm-hmm. And it was during that time that we began to become more aware of the significance of Australia and New Zealand as key battleground countries as it pertains to sex trafficking and prostitution. And the reason for that is that Nefarious deals with this issue of how do we legislate against trafficking. We had gone to Sweden, where we learned about this very progressive, effective law that they had passed, which we've referred to numerous times on this podcast. And just to simplify the language, we refer to this law as the Abolition Model of legislation. I know some others have referred to it as the Equality Model or the Nordic Model. Essentially, it's the criminalization of the purchase of sex at a felony level offense. So what we discovered in the producing of Nefarious is that this law was really groundbreaking at addressing trafficking and eradicating trafficking in Sweden. So we had gone to Amsterdam that had essentially an opposite law, which was basically, decriminalizing the sex industry, decriminalizing the purchase of sex, pimping, brothel keeping, all aspects. And it was really interesting to see those two countries, the Netherlands and Sweden, held up against each other, and to see the sort of the reflection of their legislation in the landscape of trafficking and prostitution in their country. They could not be more polar opposite. In Sweden, we were out late at night and you felt so safe. There was just this feeling of peace and safety in the streets, walking around at 1 o'clock in the morning. And we feature that in Nefarious. For anyone who hasn't seen Nefarious, it is a little bit older now. We released it in 2011, started producing in 2008, but it's, I think, just still such a foundational documentary to understand global sex trafficking. But the contrast between that experience and then going to the streets of Amsterdam at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, could not be more polar opposite, where there were panic alarms going off at all hours. There were stag parties of 30, 40 men, in a drunken stupor descending on these women. It was unbridled chaos. And so that for us was it left this huge impression on us. And we walked away from the creation of Nefarious with this deep conviction that this law really needs to be embraced as the global standard dealing with trafficking around the world. And then the Nefarious tour began, and we started to get requests from Australia and New Zealand. And what we learned is that Australia and New Zealand had also followed suit after the Netherlands, not Sweden, and had created a fully decriminalized industry of prostitution that has really opened the floodgates to trafficking. And so, so when we think about places around the world where prostitution is prominent, where trafficking is thriving, Australia and New Zealand really stand out as key battleground countries. So most recently, we completed a documentary, Buying Her, that we've been taking out, and you had an opportunity to bring Buying Her to Australia and New Zealand. And I'd love for you just to recap that trip and summarize kind of your experience in going there, since it is, again, just such an important place for us to be doing this work.
Yeah, I think that's such a important distinction of the juxtaposition between Amsterdam and Sweden. And I've done outreach in both of those countries and seen the landscape there. And I think when people in the States talk about we just need to legalize prostitution, that would solve trafficking, it's a complete myth. It couldn't be further from the truth. And in response, we often say, well, look at countries where prostitution has been legalized. The Netherlands, Germany, Australia has that been effective there? And the answer is a resounding no. And we went to tour Buying Her in Australia and New Zealand at the invitation of the Australian government because in a really exciting recent move, South Australia, one of the main states in Australia, has introduced the Abolition Nordic model. Equality model is what they're calling it there. And it hasn't passed yet, but it is in the process of. And so the amazing Member of Parliament, Nicola Centofonti, reached out, and I told her about this film that we've created that is the first documentary that unpacks and investigates sex buyers. It's going to be online for anyone who's wondering. In the next few months, we're creating our own platform where we're going to have all of our films hosted, housed, to be streamed. And that's something we're often asked. And
we'll get more on that later.
We will.
Because that's a big announcement.
That is a big announcement. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, we have 4 new film projects coming out and our new platform. So let's come back to that because that's a really exciting development.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
So at the invitation of the Australian government, in accordance with their campaign to introduce this law, we decided to do a screening. And if we're going to go to Australia, let's do a few in-person screenings. So we went to 4 different cities and then 2 cities in New Zealand. And there's a few differences between full decriminalization of prostitution and legalized prostitution in countries where there's legal prostitution, and that would include Nevada here in the States. In a few counties, the government tax brothels. There's more quote unquote regulation, but essentially, like you say, pimps become managers, third parties, brothels become legal. These houses of often trafficking victims or women, very vulnerable women being exploited or dropped off at these brothels by their very pimps. It becomes normalized when something is legalized. Fully decriminalizing something removes pretty much all regulations. So it's even in some ways you could argue, a further extreme step. Like the sex industry being one of the most exploitative, dangerous industries, to remove all regulations around it seems absolutely wild. But it was under the premise of we want to make this distinction between prostitution and consenting adults who want to make these liberal choices with their bodies, and it being branded under this bizarre ideology that it's somehow sex positive to have vulnerable women's bodies being rented in a brothel. This passed in, I believe, 2003 in New Zealand by 1 vote to fully decriminalize. And the reason why it's so important is because often groups in the US that are wanting to fully decriminalize prostitution here refer to New Zealand as this poster child nation of this is the kind of law we need in America. I was in Washington, D.C. in 2019 where that bill was essentially attempted to be passed here, and luckily it failed. But ever since then, I've always felt like it would be really important to go to both New Zealand and Australia and see what the outworking of prostitution and trafficking is there. I actually have a friend who's a survivor in the UK who was trafficked in a legal brothel in Australia, and her experience was horrific. But anyway, one day in between the 2 screenings that we did in New Zealand, I went with a local advocate who does outreach in different brothels and with women in the sex industry. And she took me to a few different brothels in that area. And one of them was the most crazy situation you could possibly imagine. A university campus in a main city in Tauranga, New Zealand, right in the middle of this college campus was a brothel, a grey concrete square cube of a brothel. And I took a video because it was like university building, office, brothel. And behind this brothel was a strip club. And there were old guys coming in and out of the brothel. There were students walking past as well. And I was told that this brothel directly recruits students at the university. And when there's job fairs and things, this brothel is trying to present itself as a good job opportunity for students to pay their way through college. And I was so shocked. Like, I've never seen it, something, the outworking of a full decriminalization law is a society that completely normalizes prostitution, that frames it as a job like any other, that it would be completely normal for an 18-year-old student to have their body rented for sex by old misogynistic men coming in and out, wanting to exploit them in that way. And I just felt really outraged, and went to a couple of other brothels where I went inside one, and actually I wasn't planning on going inside. I was just kind of taking some photos, trying to investigate what from the outside. But then the manager opened the door and said, "Would you like to come in?" And I found myself inside, and I said, I just wondered if I could have some information to take away. And she was like, "Oh, are you interested as a customer, or would you want to work here?" And so we hadn't really decided what we were going to say in that situation, but I was just like, I'm part of a group that makes documentaries on the sex industry, and actually we just wondered, could we ask you some questions? That would be really interesting to us. And so she agreed to answer some questions. Meanwhile, there was one Indian girl there who didn't speak much English, who was there, and again, old guys coming in during our conversation. She shared with us that most girls only stay in this brothel a few weeks, like 2 or 3 months. And we were kind of like, well, why is that? And she immediately got a bit uncomfortable and didn't really want to say why, and was just like, well, they need a break. And the fact that in these places, within a few blocks, were middle schools and high schools. Like, I saw kids in school uniforms walking past, and outside the brothels, there are these sex shops with huge window displays. And I don't think people really realize, if you're advocating for legal prostitution or fully decriminalized prostitution, a brothel could pop up in the middle of a college campus. A brothel could pop up right next to your high school, or middle school. Is that a culture that we want to normalize girls being sold for sex? And I think the resounding answer is no. In Australia, there's a real, again, cultural push to completely normalize prostitution. Many of the girls who are in it are Indigenous populations in New Zealand, Maori women. We actually went with a survivor who took us to the very brothel where she was first exploited in as a trafficking survivor. And that building has been completely renovated. And so it was a really powerful moment for her to revisit 20 years later the brothel that she was trafficked in, to see that building transformed. And now she's with us on the tour, advocating in Parliament, speaking on all these panels. Her name is Ali Marie Diamond, and she's an incredible survivor leader. But yeah, there's a real messaging battleground. Like, when we were in the Parliament in Australia, South Australia, the day of the screening, we were inviting different offices to come to the Buying Her screening. And one leader of one certain party just said to me, well, we won't be supporting this legislation, so I won't be attending your screening. And just the brash boldness of, like, brazenly saying, I don't support sex buyers and third parties being held accountable. I don't support exploited women being offered housing and services instead of arrest, which is essentially what the Abolition Model is. And I think for us, the biggest contention is always around education. Like, as soon as someone is really educated on the history of the abolition model, how it got passed in Sweden, the effectiveness of it, the data, and the cultural impact, where in Sweden, the chief police of the prostitution unit there, Simon Hagstrom, told me, and others have echoed similar sentiments, that the cultural impact of the Nordic abolition model is that young boys grow up seeing sex and money as something that shouldn't go together, that consent can't be bought, that the money is inherent evidence of coercion and the lack of free mutual agency and consent, enthusiastic consent, that it's always an invitation for exploitation where you allow vulnerable people to be exploited and sold. And for anyone who isn't educated around this law, yes, watch Nefarious. We've created a few animated videos on our website, exoduscry.com/watch, because the long-term goal of, if we're asking the questions, how do we end human trafficking? It's this law. This law has been the most effective in reducing trafficking. It's the bare minimum, and then the implementation goes ahead. But that's why we're advocating for it. But in conclusion, the tour was really successful. Just seeing so many people educated on the violence in prostitution, the connection between prostitution and trafficking, and having that case made by the sex buyers themselves, them sharing their stories, the insight into the journey of how men go from being a child exposed to pornography to a sex buyer purchasing trafficking victims. It's a really, really powerful film, and we're really excited to be able to share it with the world soon.
Thank you for going. That's a long flight and exhausting, but I love how you always come back so full, so energized after these trips of connecting and networking and pouring out, and there's a lot, in doing these screenings, like you mentioned, some of the blowback. And so thank you for just your courage and continuing to go out, and engage with people, engage with legislators, engage with people in the sex industry, engage with, audiences. And it means a lot for me, just as, your friend and as the filmmaker, because there's so much that I pour into making these films, and by the time it comes around to getting them out, I don't always have the energy for that. So it's nice to have this great partnership where I can really work hard on making the films, and you do so much to help get the films out there. And then, of course, Daniel and our whole marketing team is helpful with that as well. But this idea of a brothel on a university campus, I remember, numerous times giving talks about trying to help people understand the agenda of the pro-sex work movement, and people looking at me like these glazed over looks, like, nah, that's not real. When talking about how, the goal, the agenda of the pro-sex work movement is to have brothels in every community.
Of course.
Right? So that is their vision, to fully normalize prostitution in communities and societies and neighborhoods around the world.
Yeah.
And you see mega brothels, these gigantic brothels that, service hundreds of people a day, in places like Spain, Germany. And then you hear, places like Australia where they have brothels now emerging on college campuses. People may look at that and think, wow, that's a really one-off anomaly. And it's like, no, it's not. This is the manifestation of the vision of the pro-sex work movement.
Yeah.
And so it's, I think, really important for us to recognize the threat that exists by the pro-sex work movement agenda, because who is that really helping? I mean, when you put brothels in every neighborhood on college campuses, you are welcoming soliciting, marketing, seducing the participation of men to buy into the ethic or lack thereof of using their money to gain access to a female's body. And, just speaking to our male audience out there, there's not one man on this planet who really believes in his heart that that is okay. Regardless of what they may say, there's not one man who actually believes in his heart that that is okay. Every man knows instinctively there is something wrong with this picture. If I am having to use money to purchase a person's consent to gain access to their body, there's something wrong with that. Many people have seared their conscience or even bought into the power dynamics, and that's part of the erotic allure of it. But they know instinctively that it's wrong. And yet, this is the premise that the pro-sex work movement operates on, is welcoming, seducing, luring, manipulating the participation of men in these transactions. Now, their cover narrative would say that this is very empowering for the women because look at all the money they're making and look at all the agency that they have and all this and that. We've talked about that many, many times, and I don't need to deconstruct all that right now. But the point being is you are creating prostitution cultures, prostitution communities. You are creating a collective mindset that enables men to subjugate women for a price. When that becomes part of the consciousness of a community and of a society, you begin to see this gigantic disparity in equality. And so there can be no equality between men and women as long as we are welcoming, colluding with, enabling, supporting, celebrating the mindset that says this is acceptable behavior for men. Because prostitution is a construct of male demand. The men are there, right, to do what they want to the woman. This is not about her desire, her preferences. So the entire construct of prostitution is a result of male demand. And so it is a system inherently of gender inequality. Why? Given all of our advancements in this world, would we want to go back to a system that is going to subjugate women? Why would we want to go back to a system that is going to contribute towards this gigantic disparity and equality for men and women that is built upon subjugation, humiliation, and degradation, and often violation and violent harm towards women? It doesn't make any sense. No amount of talk about liberation, sexual empowerment, blah, 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 can do away with the fundamental dynamics of what prostitution is. So then you put this on a college campus, right? And it's coming closer and closer to our doorstep. It's coming closer and closer, younger and younger, right? Let's right out the gate from high school, boom, let's normalize this.
Yeah.
And then for all of that to be held up as some kind of human rights accomplishment. Like, hey, look how progressive we are, is the whole thing is a sham. And there's just nobody out there who's actually boldly declaring the emperor is not wearing clothes.
By age 13, most kids have already been exposed to porn. This disturbing, very often violent content is not only traumatizing children, it's toxically rewiring their sexual templates. More than ever before, we must protect our kids from the life-altering consequences of underage exposure. That's why we launched the Protect Children Not Porn campaign, calling for laws that require porn sites to use ID-based age verification to ensure its site visitors are at least 18 years old. Since we launched the campaign, 10 states have already passed this law, and many more have introduced it, but we need to push for all 50. Sign our petition at exoduscry.com/PCNP so we can protect millions of children from porn. A lot of survivors told me that the media journalists don't want to hear their stories if it contradicts the narrative. Like, especially in New Zealand, the government wants to keep this narrative that our law has fought and eradicated human trafficking when it's not true, but they don't want to hear from survivors contradicting that or pointing out to the stories. And this one survivor, Ali, who was with us, had so many stories of trafficking victims who were underage, children being sold, teenagers. And I think going back to the example of Germany and the Netherlands or Amsterdam, if anyone's ever been to Amsterdam and walked through the red light district, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. It's the most bizarre. Here in 2024, I cannot believe that there are still women being sold in windows like a mannequin. Like it felt like a slap in the face of every woman. Like, this is the epitome of dehumanizing and objectifying to a woman. Not only that, but the majority of them are not Dutch women. They are from poorer Eastern European countries who often don't speak much English, who don't have a lot of rights, who are trafficked either by mafia, organized crime, or extremely vulnerable and sending money back to their families. But even that's not okay. That's never a justification. Like, a society is failing a woman if that ever is what she's having to resort to. And I did outreach to all the women in the windows. We were giving out red roses when I was there in partnership with a drop-in center. And like you said, there's hundreds, thousands of mostly men swarming the streets or tourists. Amsterdam literally began a campaign a year or two ago called a Stay Away campaign, because they have recognized the utter failing that it has been, the invitation to organized crime it has been. But it's this, we don't want to admit that, so we'll quietly just shut down the propaganda bus tours. We'll quietly just shut down a few windows. We'll quietly try this Stay Away campaign targeted at actually British male tourists who are some of the worst, who, I mean, just talking to some of these precious women and the tragic stories of how they even ended up there. And then I turn around and there's like 10 college students who I just want to take them aside and be like, boys, let me tell you what her story is, or let me tell you the reality of prostitution. Let me tell you about the scores of women that we are supporting in therapy for decades later, trying to heal from the trauma of what prostitution does to their heart, mind, body, soul, spirit. Think through what your actions are. And that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is the real predatory kind of sex buyers with much more violent intentions. But in Amsterdam, I just was seeing so many men, and it's a bit of like a Vegas situation of where it's normal. It's like, oh, I guess my moral compass goes out the window. Where it's legal, I guess this is okay. That's why like the law is so important around sex buying and brothel keeping, because where something is legal, it sends this message that it's an okay part of society. Where something is illegal or a felony level offense, that sends a really powerful message that this is not okay. And I've also been inside some of the mega brothels in Germany, and also toilet cubicles on the street where we did outreach, a wooden cubicle that has a sign saying this can be used as a toilet or as a brothel exchange. Like in German, I had got a photo of it. Someone said this is a government sign explaining that this wooden toilet cubicle can be used as a brothel. And inside, and I took a video, there was blooded tissues, condoms, needles. Talk about empowering for women, talk about women's liberation in prostitution. Like, how can anyone possibly think that this is in any way empowering for women? It doesn't matter how much she's getting paid, or more likely her pimp's getting paid. This is the biggest gaslight on women and girls. And there is a nefarious agenda behind it. And there is a real, like, if you get too deep into it, it's pretty dark, and it's deeply violent and destructive towards women and girls. And people are thought to be a prude if you challenge that. And it's like, this is the most harmful form of sexuality for girls. Like, talk to any prostitution survivor who can no longer even, in many cases, have a enjoyable functioning sex life because of the trauma of prostitution. And that is something that isn't talked about much by anyone.
It suggests that sexual access for men is more important than women's dignity. And I'm going to make a controversial statement, but it needs to be said. Not everyone should have access to sex, just straight up.
It's not a human right.
Right. Everyone should have access to housing, food, water, the basic necessities of life. Sex involves two people. How can you say that every person should be given access to sex? That's not real. The dynamic between two people requires men to grow and mature and evolve and develop into somebody who has the safety, the strength, the social intelligence, the emotional intelligence to attract somebody into this very vulnerable, intimate encounter.
Right.
What prostitution does is provide a way for men to completely bypass all of that. Well, I don't have to develop these parts of myself, grow, become strong, build my emotional and social acumen, be able to provide economically for another person. I just can bypass all of those things and with a credit card, go buy access to another human being's body. And of course, we know the outfall of that for women, even though, again, it's repackaged and sold to us as something empowering. That's not the truth of the reality of it. And so I feel like it's important to address that and to say that no, not everybody should have access to sex. We need to stop saying that.
Mm-hmm.
There's not all these poor, lonely, socially isolated men that, are just going to disappear if they can't buy a woman.
Mm-hmm.
That's not real.
Right.
The poor, lonely, socially isolated man living in his mom's basement needs to stop playing video games and drinking, and he needs to go get an education, go get a job, go be around other men, figure out, right? And I have compassion for people who have struggled in life to develop their masculine core and embrace the responsibility that comes with being an adult, but that's life. Like it's not fair for anyone, but we have choices. The power that we have is the power to choose to make our life different, to contribute to our own growth, to become a better person, to eventually be able to be responsible enough to attract a female. That's the hard work that these men need to participate in.
Yeah.
Not be given this false compassion message about, oh, you poor, we'll just give you access to women. Go borrow your mommy's credit card and you can come buy little Daisy over here. Like, what?
It's so demeaning to men as well, because I think like that's such a harmful, toxic message for them to choose that lifestyle, to embrace that, because I remember talking to a sex buyer in Cambodia who said, I have to pay a woman to touch me because I'm pathetic. Like no one would ever want to be with me. And I was kind of like, that is a really twisted perspective and not true, but really sad that you don't believe you have it in you. But then it's kind of used as this get out. Well, I probably never date, or maybe I'm too lazy to put in the work or whatever it takes. That takes a lot of courage and vulnerability and work and effort. And for some guys, it's easier to just pay someone and completely disassociate, disconnect. But it's deeply dehumanizing for both of those individuals in that interaction. During the tour in Australia, after one of the Buying Her screenings, this guy came up to me who was autistic, and he told me that he was wearing a T-shirt that said "Stop Demand." And he said, I used to be a sex buyer, I used to be a porn addict, and my autism even played into my addiction, where I had to watch the same porn videos at the same time every day. And then the nature of my autism played into my porn addiction. And then he said, there's this message for people with autism and disabilities that women in prostitution, that's a way that you can have sex. And we do hear these stories about care homes or disabled people, they need access to sex, like exactly what you were saying earlier, this kind of subtle message that it's a human right to have sex. And so the thought that there could be a disabled man or an autistic guy who might not be able to be in an autonomous relationship, which isn't even true. How insulting for disabled people to say you'll never be able to be in a loving relationship, therefore the sex industry is your only sexual option. But this young guy was telling me, he was like, that was such a harmful message, and I now see that it's not true at all. And I mean, he had his own way of explaining it, but he was essentially like, I now understand that pornography is exploitative, the harms of prostitution. I would never pay anyone for sex. And he completely rejected that entire lifestyle. And he was in his own way trying to understand his own role in the participation of exploiting someone. But he recognized the messages that he'd internalized that said, it's your human right. And you will never be able to get a woman, therefore go and pay for one. For people who are trying to justify prostitution, for them to use that as an argument is a completely poor, rude, and exploitative argument.
It's a form of false compassion is what it is.
Yeah.
It has the appearance of compassion, but how can it be compassion when it elevates one party at the exclusion and invisibility of the other, right? Or requires all of these semantic gymnastics to explain the experience of the other, right? So the idea being like, oh, we're so compassionate because we see these lonely, isolated, socially awkward or disabled men, or all the things that are said, right, about these men. Oh, we're so compassionate. Surely they need to have access. Okay, well, how are you going to get them that access? Well, let's not worry about that too much, because this female over here, she's having an empowered experience. Well, okay, let's talk to her about that. How empowering is it after the 25th guy that week who has a different fantasy every time that he wants to offload and project onto you, treating you as an object and a receptacle, and oftentimes bypassing any boundary that you attempt to create for yourself, right? Like, it's such a thin veil. And yet our society collectively buys into these things. Why are people allowing themselves to be so duped into saying that the emperor is wearing clothes? Oh, look what beautiful garments you have. Oh, it's not just with prostitution. There's so many things that are being jammed down our throat in our society today.
Yeah.
And because of the cancel culture, people have this reluctance to just say the obvious, to state the obvious, to declare the emperor is not wearing clothes. Stop trying to dupe me into buying into and believing in your very flimsy, shallow notion of what human rights is supposed to look like. And so the attempt to present oneself as compassionate has become the license to gain the moral high ground. And I think what we're now seeing is widespread movements of false compassion. If it's genuine, authentic compassion, then all parties must be considered. You can't present yourself as compassionate when you're only in consideration of, one over the other. And so a truly empathetic and compassionate view of this issue is to see, okay, well, maybe there are some men out there that are socially isolated. Let's figure out what their deeper need is for intimacy and human connection, and how we can help heal and repair and build those men to become somebody who's able to attract a female. Let's do the real work. And on the female side of things, let's recognize the vulnerability that is a result for which so many of these women wind up in these exploited positions. And let's figure out social programs, housing, services for single moms, ways to fill in the gap for these vulnerable demographics to be supported. That is a truly, genuinely authentic position.
Yeah.
But the position that's just, oh, these poor men, so they should have that's not compassion. And it needs to be called out for what it is. Along with that, there's compounding marginalization based on certain demographics of women whom we deem less valuable. So for example, in Canada, Indigenous women, there's an epidemic of the violation of Indigenous women in Canada because they are viewed as less valuable. So what the sex industry does is it serves as a vacuum to pull in, it's a vortex that pulls in the most marginalized and vulnerable demographics of women in the world. So the Indigenous population would be one of them, right? And so it's, these poor men need access to, so let's find them women that they can have access to, but not just any women, right? We'll find the ones that are, a little less valuable, the impoverished woman, the stateless one in Thailand, the Indigenous woman of Canada, the African-American woman in the ghetto, so they classify these certain demographics of women as having less value and therefore more justifiable to participate in this. Of course, they would never say that, but that is what it is. Look at the vast demographic of women being exploited in the sex industry. First of all, many underage, so literal children, right, that are vulnerable, and then ethnicity, economic status, child sexual abuse. There's so many things that contribute towards this collective idea in society of who's valuable and who's not. And, even men participate in this by saying, well, I would never do this with my wife, but I'll do it with this person. Why? Because this person is less valuable. Well, they were abused as a child. We can take advantage of that one, And so I think unearthing the consciousness that supports the commercial sex industry is important for people to have a true picture of what it is and to stop buying into this notion that this has something to do with compassion. It's the opposite of compassion, is what it is.
Yeah. The racism, the classism, why is it, if this industry is empowering, why is it that the majority are the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, is their own desperation being exploited, their own vulnerability being exploited. And you see that across the world. But what we see with wanting to legalize prostitution is trying to take the most privileged or a naive college student saying, well, I've been told I could make a lot of money in this, and I'm willingly choosing to enter into this. Some women do choose to enter the sex industry willingly, but what we see time and time again is that within a few days, weeks, or months, whatever they thought, whatever the current narrative of this industry was, it was a complete gaslight, a completely false experience, and they are robbed, raped, the violence, the degradation, all of that. But then we see often academic or groups that have never been in the sex industry in their life, but they like the concept of the sex trade for various different reasons. And they want to build legislation around the experience of what they might deem as the most privileged few. And so when you legalize prostitution, saying, well, we want these two consenting adults to be able to make this choice without stigma. We don't want the sex buyers to be stigmatized by them being criminalized. So we want it to be fully decriminalized, fully legal.
But there should be stigma around certain things in the world, right?
Around
There's
violence, around exploitation.
Around smoking crack, rightfully so.
Right.
Like,
exactly.
if you want to buy access to a child's body, there should be stigma there.
Yeah.
So this idea that like, oh, anything that's stigma just needs to, that's the problem.
That is the problem.
Like, it's going to compromise our mental health. Well, maybe it should. Like, if we're not behaving in ways that align with the fundamental, intrinsic way that we were designed and what we're created for, like, the system's going to break.
Yeah.
You are going to have compromised your mental health. Maybe you should be asking about the decisions that you're making in life that have compromised your mental health, rather than just there's stigma and it needs to be gone. It's like those convictions, that consciousness, those feelings of guilt, whatever it is, are there for a reason.
Right.
They're telling you that you are participating and behaving in something that is not good for you or the person that you're doing this to.
Yeah. The brothel owner in New Zealand told me that in her opinion, stigma around brothels was the biggest issue. And she's saying that as someone who it's been decriminalized for 20 years, but there's still stigma. So this whole idea of if we decriminalize it, that removes the stigma. Firstly, that isn't true. And secondly, I was like, that is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is trafficking, exploitation, the rape, the violence, everything that we see in this industry. That is a much bigger problem than stigma around sex buying. And why is there a stigma around sex buying? Because like you said, Benji, everyone knows deep down, if there's money involved, there's a stigma around it because it's not truly mutual consenting relationship.
Next thing you know, they're going to be having pimp parades to remove the stigma around pimps. And don't be surprised if that happens, honestly. Where they're out parading in the streets about the need to decriminalize pimps. These poor pimps, they get such a bad rap. Like there's a level of ridiculousness about it. And it's truly bizarre to me to see the collective adoption and embrace of these, pro-sex work movement ideals. It's an indictment against the sad condition of our society today.
Yeah.
And hence the reason for which we are having this podcast and having these conversations and is to highlight this. Like, we're simply not content to live in a world where these things that remain as they are with the status quo. We have to shift the locus of thought and the mass consciousness of society around these issues dealing with the sex industry in order to pave the way for the freedom, deliverance, and healing of those who are oppressed and exploited and in these, subjugated positions. It's not right.
Yeah. Well, on an encouraging note, the Chancellor of Germany, for the first time a few months ago, acknowledged that legal prostitution has been really negative and harmful for Germany, and the opposition political party have taken on a pro-abolitionist Nordic model approach. So that was unprecedented. Maine just became the first state last year to introduce a soft abolition approach. I don't believe it went far enough either side, but that has been a first state. There's currently 8 countries that have passed this law. And our long-term dream is to see every nation, especially nations that are known for sex tourism, adopt this law. And so we're seeing movement in Spain, clearly in Australia. If South Australia passes the abolitionist model this year, that would be huge and would have a ripple effect across Australia. And more survivors are speaking out. And so that was another beautiful fruit of the tour of survivors finding their voice, connecting with one another, feeling less isolated, less lonely. And that's probably the biggest threat against the pro-sex work movement or the pro-pimp lobby, is when survivors really find their voice, speak out, organize, and get involved politically, because they're not afraid to speak the truth. They will share exactly what goes on in the sex trade and why it's harmful and why pimps should not be decriminalized, why brothels should not be legal. So that is our hope for Australia, our hope for New Zealand, our hope for Europe, our hope for the US, that they will adopt this law. And the law and culture go hand in hand. And so we're making these films, we're doing these podcasts, we're having these conversations to try and shift the culture. But I know that laws passing impact mindsets too, but often a law doesn't pass until the public have enough education and awareness. So we'll never stop educating on this point. And I hope that people learn some new things today about our approach towards the sex trade.
I just want to, before we wrap up, I just want to mention the platform that you mentioned earlier. So we have 4 new film projects coming out. Just in brief, I'll mention what those are. Buying Her, which is about the demand side of trafficking. It explores the lives of men who participated in the purchase of women. And we've been touring that film, and the feedback has been incredibly positive. It's already having a very catalytic effect everywhere we've screened it. So keep an eye out for Buying Her. That's coming out. We have another film, High Class, which is about high class escorting. And there's a twist to that. So the idea that is presented is these are quote unquote high class escorts who are have all this autonomy and making all this money. The reality is it's all trafficking. And that is something that we discovered when we investigated the sex trafficking industry of Vegas. That is also a very powerful film that's coming out, a feature-length documentary. So there's 2. Then we have a series on the porn industry coming out called Entering Pornland, which is about the individual lives of people who have gone into the porn industry and what their experience was. And lastly, we have a film coming out called Wild and Free, which is a short narrative film about one boy's journey with pornography. And it also is a very immersive, cinematic, and kind of visceral film. I'm really excited for this. It's very different from anything we've done before, and I think will really help reach a younger audience of particularly males, but it's for everyone. So we have that coming out. Now, people may wonder, where can we see these films? We're creating them to put in the hands of people, to give people as widespread access as they can to get them. So, and then to share them, do screenings, all of that. Our events manager and podcast producer, Sloan, is currently putting together screening kits for anyone who would like to screen any of our films in their local context. So keep an eye out for that. We are launching our own platform, where all of our films will be available, and they will be available there for free. So we're creating this platform to give people wide, broad accessibility to watch our films and to share them. And that platform will be launching in around August. So that's something that is that we're excited about. We've been working on just one platform where all of our projects are consolidated, all of our film projects, and people can go to one place to see any of them for free. And then we will also be making these films available everywhere that you can stream films. So Amazon, Google, YouTube, and there will be a rental fee associated on those platforms. But if somebody would just like to, quickly rent it off of Amazon at home for a small fee, they can do that. So we've worked very long and hard on creating these projects.
Yep.
They continue to improve in production quality and messaging. And they're highlighting these very, very important issues in our world, and specifically pertaining to these issues about the sex industry that do affect all of our lives in one way or another. And just super excited for people to be able to see them, share them, and partner with us in the work to shift mindsets and change laws. So just wanted to put that out there for everyone.
All right.
Until next time.
I can't wait. All these films been in the pipeline for a while, like in our hearts, and to finally be able to bring them to the masses is really, really exciting for us. So we just wanted to share that.
You can check out all our podcast episodes, articles, and films at exoduscry.com and join the daily conversation by following Exoduscry on all major social platforms.